It is past 3 a.m. on October 25th, 1944. The waters of the Surigao Strait are pitch black, and the Japanese southern force is disintegrating. Unseen torpedoes tear out of the dark, wiping out 3 destroyers in minutes. The battleship Fuso mysteriously vanishes from the formation. Then, the flagship itself, the Yamashiro, shudders from a direct hit. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura is trapped in a narrow corridor, bleeding ships to an invisible enemy. Yet, standing on the chaotic bridge, he issues a chilling order. The battered remnants of his fleet will push forward at 20 knots. Why would a veteran commander lead his sinking ship straight into absolute destruction? Instead of viewing this engagement from the safety of the American radar screens, watching a perfect tactical trap snap shut, we are going to experience Surigao Strait from the inside. We are stepping onto the bridge of a doomed flagship in the middle of a blinding, chaotic night. Around you, the rigid chain of command is rapidly unraveling. There is no clear picture of the enemy's strength, no plotting board showing the lethal defensive lines drawn in the dark ahead. There are only sudden, blinding explosions, frantic damage reports over static-filled radios, and the terrifying realization that your squadron is being systematically dismantled by an adversary you cannot even see. This is not a traditional story of a flawlessly executed naval ambush. This is a claustrophobic psychological nightmare of command under maximum pressure. The true mystery of Surigao Strait is not how the trap was constructed, but why an experienced, rational fleet commander willingly marched his remaining vessels into obvious annihilation. The easy answer is to dismiss it as madness or blind fanaticism, but the reality on that shattered bridge was far more complex. We are going to deconstruct the critical moments where Vice Admiral Nishimura could have turned back, and analyze why he didn't. We will strip away the hindsight of history to look exclusively through his eyes as the tactical situation deteriorated, mile by mile. But to truly comprehend the fatal momentum of that night, and why he refused to reverse course when his fleet first began to bleed, we must first look backward. Because entering that pitch-black corridor of water did not originally seem like a death sentence. To understand the fatal momentum of 1944, and why a seasoned commander would willingly commit his fleet to a narrow, lightless channel, we must look at how the Imperial Japanese Navy fundamentally defined naval warfare. Following the strict restrictions of the Washington Naval Treaty in the 1920s, which severely limited the total tonnage of their capital ships, Japanese strategists faced a grim mathematical reality. They knew they could never win a conventional, daylight war of attrition against the overwhelming industrial capacity of the United States. If they fought ship to ship, gun to gun in broad daylight, the larger American fleet would inevitably grind them into iron and ash. To level the playing field, to bridge the massive gap in industrial production, they needed a radical tactical equalizer. They found this equalizer in the shadows. For over 2 decades, the Imperial Japanese Navy obsessively cultivated a rigid doctrine built entirely around the absolute mastery of night combat. Darkness was not viewed as a hindrance, nor a chaotic environment to be avoided. It was engineered into a highly specialized, lethal weapon. While other modern navies generally avoided the extreme hazards of maneuvering heavy squadrons at high speeds in pitch blackness without running lights, the Japanese actively embraced the danger. Their night training exercises were legendary for their brutality and their realism. Fleet maneuvers were deliberately conducted in the worst possible weather conditions, pushing crews to the absolute breaking point in freezing rain, gale force winds, and heavy, unpredictable seas. The risks were immense. Collisions during these blacked-out exercises were frequent and deadly, claiming modern ships and hundreds of highly trained lives long before the war even began. Yet, the high command in Tokyo coldly accepted these peacetime casualties as the necessary, bloody cost of tactical perfection. Through this ruthless attrition, they forged a unique breed of sailors, centering their night combat capability on an elite corps of lookouts. These men were meticulously selected for possessing exceptional natural night vision. They were subjected to punishing regimes, trained to isolate and identify the faintest, most ambiguous silhouette of a ship on a moonless horizon before any machine or standard sailor could. Armed with massive, highly specialized binoculars permanently mounted on the bridges of cruisers and destroyers, these lookouts served as the ultimate organic sensors. In the era before electronic warfare dominated the seas, a trained Japanese lookout could routinely spot, track, and identify an Allied vessel thousands of yards before the Allied crew even registered they were being hunted. This supreme human element was deliberately paired with one of the most devastating technological secrets of the 20th century, the Type 93 torpedo. Western navies of the era relied on standard, compressed air torpedoes, which inherently left a highly visible, foamy trail of bubbles on the surface, a white wake that often gave targeted ships crucial seconds to throw their rudders hard over and evade destruction. Japanese engineers, working under intense secrecy, achieved what the West had dismissed as technically impossible: a reliable torpedo propelled by pure oxygen. The result was a weapon with terrifying, game-changing capabilities. The Type 93 carried a massive, explosive warhead capable of instantly breaking a heavy cruiser in half. It traveled at staggering speeds, and its operational range rivaled the maximum reach of a battleship's main battery. But most importantly, because it consumed its own oxygen, it left virtually no wake. It was an invisible assassin gliding through the deep. For years, the very existence of this oxygen weapon was a closely guarded national secret, heavily compartmentalized even within the Japanese military. Allied intelligence had absolutely no idea it existed, leading to disastrous, fatal miscalculations when the two navies finally clashed in the dark. For Nishimura and his contemporaries, this doctrine was not just theoretical paperwork drafted in a safe war room. It was a proven, blood-soaked reality that had been violently validated in battle. In the Solomon Islands campaign, particularly in the unforgiving, claustrophobic waters off Guadalcanal in the fall of 1942, this finely tuned night fighting machine was unleashed against the United States Navy with devastating effect. At the Battle of Savo Island, a force of Japanese cruisers slipped through the darkness undetected, relying exclusively on their superior optics and their silent torpedoes to inflict one of the worst tactical defeats in American naval history. They tore the Allied formation to pieces, sinking 4 heavy cruisers in a matter of chaotic minutes, while taking almost no significant damage themselves. Later, at Tassafaronga, a vastly outgunned Japanese destroyer force, attempting a simple supply run, used the Type 93 to ambush and shatter an American cruiser task force. Time and time again, the script played out exactly as the Japanese Naval Staff College had theorized. The Americans, who were heavily reliant on rigid formations, standard daylight fleet tactics, and early, primitive electronic systems that often confused them more than they helped, were completely outmatched in the dark. The night unequivocally belonged to Japan. This was not arrogance. It was an undisputed truth, hard-coded into the command psyche of every Japanese flag officer. This was the heavy tactical inheritance Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura carried with him as he stood on the bridge of the Yamashiro, plotting his final approach toward the Surigao Strait. He was commanding the Southern Force, a fleet centered around the older battleships Yamashiro and Fuso. These were ancient dreadnoughts, slow, towering relics, characterized by their massive, intricate pagoda masts that reached high into the sky. In the glaring light of day, under the undisputed, absolute control of American carrier aviation, these old ships would be nothing more than slow-moving target practice. Nishimura was a pragmatist. He knew with absolute certainty that his vessels could never survive a daylight transit of the Philippine waters. The American dive bombers and torpedo planes would send them to the bottom before they ever fired a single main battery salvo. But a night action? That fundamentally altered the entire calculus of the battle. Under the heavy cover of darkness, the extreme age and sluggish speed of his battleships mattered far less. The night would act as an impenetrable protective shield, completely neutralizing the lethal American aircraft and blinding their surface gunners. Under this black cloak, his vanguard of destroyers could push rapidly forward, utilize their superior night vision, and unleash a massive, coordinated volley of long-lance oxygen torpedoes. They would carve bloody, burning holes in whatever defensive lines stood in their way, tearing the American formation apart before a single gun was fired. Then, the heavy 14-inch guns of his surviving battleships would sweep in to clean up the shattered remnants at close range, exactly as the doctrine dictated. It was a brutal, straightforward plan, entirely consistent with everything the Imperial Japanese Navy had believed, obsessively practiced, and successfully executed for 20 years. As Nishimura ordered his ships to maintain speed and push deeper into the black throat of the strait, he felt the heavy comfort of historical precedent. He was not a madman leading a suicide charge. He was a commander operating within the strict, proven logic of his own navy. He believed darkness was his ultimate advantage, the natural, chaotic environment where Japanese discipline, optics, and steel always prevailed. He saw the night as his shield, entirely unaware of how radically the Americans had transformed their tactics, their technology, and their mastery of the dark since those early, bloody lessons of 1942. But the protective cloak of the Philippine night was torn away long before the Southern force ever reached the narrow entrance to the strait. The fundamental prerequisite for the Imperial Japanese Navy's night tactics was absolute surprise. You cannot ambush an enemy that is already tracking you. On the morning of October 24th, American carrier aircraft had spotted Nishimura's column navigating the Sulu Sea. He had been bombed from the sky. The physical damage to the battleship Fuso was relatively light, but the tactical damage was catastrophic. The element of surprise was dead. The Americans knew a heavy Japanese surface force was coming. Still, Nishimura pressed on, hoping that the darkness would at least blind the American surface ships once he entered the confined waters. By 10:30 p.m., the Japanese vanguard crossed into Surigao Strait. Instead of the quiet, undetected approach dictated by the Naval Academy textbooks, the darkness immediately erupted into a chaotic swarm of harassment. Waiting in the shadows were dozens of American PT boats, small, fast, mahogany-hulled vessels armed with torpedoes. These boats did not possess the firepower to sink a dreadnought, but their primary weapon that night was not their erratic torpedoes, it was their radios. As the PT boats darted in and out of the Japanese formation, trading blind machine gun fire with Nishimura's screening destroyers, they were transmitting a steady, uninterrupted stream of real-time intelligence back to the American command. Every time a Japanese destroyer fired a star shell or swept a searchlight across the water to chase away a PT boat, they were merely illuminating their own exact position. Sitting on the bridge of the Yamashiro, Nishimura watched the flashes of tracer fire skipping across the black water and listened to the reports from his lookouts. He understood the grim reality of the situation. His exact speed, his northern heading, and the composition of his column were being broadcast directly to the enemy. The psychological pressure of this realization was immense. The defining advantage of the Japanese Navy, the invisible, stealthy strike, had completely evaporated. He was walking down a dark hallway, and the enemy was tracking his every footstep. To make matters worse, Nishimura was operating in a devastating tactical vacuum. The complex Japanese master plan, Operation Sho-Go, relied on the precise convergence of multiple independent fleets. Admiral Kiyohide Shima was commanding a secondary support force that was supposed to reinforce Nishimura's push. But the Imperial Navy's command structure was notoriously fractured. Nishimura and Shima had no combined training, no unified command, and critically, no effective communication. As Nishimura absorbed the PT boat attacks, Shima's cruisers were 40 miles behind him in the dark. They were not sharing radar data, they were not coordinating their speeds, and they were not maneuvering as a single fist. Nishimura was entirely isolated. In any standard tactical environment, a commander who has lost the element of surprise, whose formation is actively being tracked, and whose reinforcements are completely out of contact, would have the basic initiative to pause. He would turn around, regroup in open water, or wait for Shima to close the 40-mile gap. But Nishimura did not have that authority. The rigid, unforgiving timetable drafted by distant superiors in Tokyo demanded that he break through Surigao Strait and strike the American landing zones at Leyte Gulf by dawn, perfectly timed, with Admiral Kurita's massive center force arriving from the north. A delay meant the entire strategic timetable would collapse. The plan was fixed in stone. It left absolutely no room for a commander on the ground to adapt to the reality of the night. On the bridge of the Yamashiro, the trap was already closing around his mind before the first heavy shell was ever loaded. Knowing the Americans were waiting, knowing his exact coordinates were being plotted on maps he could not see, and knowing he had no support behind him, Nishimura made the only choice the system allowed him. He refused to break the timetable. He ordered the column to maintain its speed. Stripped of his stealth and robbed of his tactical initiative, he crossed the point of no return, moving deeper into a corridor where the enemy already knew exactly where he was. As the Yamashiro pushed past the chaotic skirmishes with the PT boats, the atmosphere on the flagship's bridge fundamentally shifted. The sporadic, high-speed harassment faded, replaced by an eerie, heavy silence settling over the black water of the strait. It was past 2 in the morning. Nishimura was now sailing completely blind. The elite Japanese lookouts, gripping their massive binoculars, strained their eyes against the absolute darkness, desperate for any visual cue. But the horizon offered nothing. No silhouettes, no running lights, only the impenetrable blackness of a narrow sea corridor. What Nishimura did not know, what he could not possibly fathom from his rigid tactical perspective, was that the American strategy for night combat had entirely evolved past the need for human eyes. Miles away, in the unseen northern reaches of the strait, the darkness was not a shield, it was an illuminated map. Aboard the American destroyer squadrons, the combat information centers were bathed in the sterile, pale green glow of advanced SG surface search radar. The Japanese formation, a terrifying, invincible phantom in the waters off Guadalcanal 2 years prior, was now reduced to a series of helpless, glowing blips crawling predictably across a glass screen. The Americans were not guessing at the Japanese speed or heading. They were tracking every single maneuver with mechanical precision. They watched the heavy battleships, the cruisers, and the destroyers moving exactly where the PT boats had reported them. The American destroyer commanders, executing perfectly synchronized battle plans, did not need to wait for visual identification. They did not need to rely on the chaotic, localized flashes of star shells to find their targets. Guided entirely by their radar screens, they began to maneuver down the flanks of the strait. They were moving into attack positions, completely cloaked by the darkness, watching the Japanese column steam blindly into the kill zone. On the Yamashiro, the first indication that they were being hunted was not a visual sighting, but a sudden, violent disruption of the sea. Without warning, the American destroyers, having crept to within 4 miles of the Japanese column, unleashed their torpedoes. It was a massive, coordinated salvo, fired with calculated precision based on the radar plots. And the moment the torpedoes left their tubes, the American destroyers violently executed hard turns, laying down thick, choking walls of chemical smoke to cover their retreat. They vanished back into the blackness before the Japanese lookouts could even register their presence. For Nishimura, the nightmare was no longer a theoretical fear. It was instantly, violently realized. At approximately 3 a.m., the sea around the Japanese column erupted. The unseen torpedoes found their marks with devastating accuracy. The destroyer Yamagumo, a vital component of Nishimura's vanguard, simply ceased to exist in a blinding, catastrophic flash of burning ammunition and ruptured boilers. The shockwave of the explosion hammered against the hull of the Yamashiro, a brutal, physical manifestation of the invisible enemy's reach. Moments later, frantic radio reports crackled onto the flagship's bridge. The destroyers Michishio and Asagumo were crippled, their engines dead, drifting helplessly out of the formation, burning brightly in the dark, and illuminating the Japanese column even further. In a matter of minutes, the vanguard, the precise tool designed to clear the path for the battleships, had been entirely dismantled. Nishimura was losing his fleet, piece by piece, to an adversary he could not even see to shoot at. The claustrophobia on the bridge must have been suffocating. The Japanese optical superiority, the core of their night-fighting doctrine, was completely useless against an enemy striking from beyond visual range, guided by a technology that turned the night itself into a weapon against them. But the destruction of the destroyers was only the beginning of the collapse. Somewhere in the chaotic, smoke-filled darkness behind the flagship, the battleship Fuso was fighting its own silent, desperate battle. The enduring, heavily dramatized legend, often repeated in post-war accounts, claimed that the Fuso was instantly obliterated by a torpedo hit, violently breaking into 2 massive burning halves that drifted apart like funeral pyres in the strait. But modern analysis of the wreck site and a careful reevaluation of surviving Japanese action reports paint a much quieter and arguably more terrifying picture of her demise. The Fuso was struck by a torpedo launched by the American destroyer USS Melvin. The hit was critical, rupturing the old dreadnought's fragile underwater defenses and causing catastrophic flooding. But she did not explode in a spectacular fireball. Instead, the Fuso simply began to lose speed, quietly and fatally falling out of the column. She slipped away into the absolute darkness, her radios silent, her massive silhouette vanishing from the Yamashiro's view. On the flagship, there was no dramatic confirmation of her loss, only a sudden, chilling absence. The Fuso, carrying nearly her entire crew, was dying alone in the black water, leaving Nishimura with only a fraction of his original heavy firepower. The pressure on the Yamashiro's bridge was now absolute. The formation was shattered. The vanguard was gone. Half of his battleship's strength had silently disappeared, and then the flagship itself was targeted. A torpedo, weaving through the chaos of the burning destroyers, slammed into the side of the Yamashiro. The massive ship shuddered under the impact. Damage control teams frantically reported flooding, and the flagship's speed immediately began to bleed away. Nishimura was now standing on a damaged vessel, surrounded by burning wreckage, facing a technologically superior enemy that was systematically destroying his command without ever revealing themselves. At this precise moment, the tactical logic of the operation had completely collapsed. The surprise was gone. The vanguard was destroyed. The Fuso was lost. The Yamashiro was hit. The enemy possessed a devastating radar advantage that negated every aspect of Japanese night fighting doctrine. In any standard naval engagement, this was the undisputed point of retreat. This was the moment to turn the heavily damaged flagship south, order the surviving destroyers to lay smoke, and attempt to salvage whatever fragments of the southern force remained. Yet, Vice Admiral Nishimura, standing amidst the chaos on the bridge of his crippled flagship, coldly assessed the catastrophic damage. He listened to the frantic reports of the dying ships around him. He felt the sluggish response of the Yamashiro's engines, and then he issued an order that defied all tactical reason. He instructed his remaining vessels, the damaged Yamashiro, the heavy cruiser Mogami, and a lone surviving destroyer, Shigure, to maintain a speed of 20 knots and continue their advance into the dark northern reaches of the strait. He refused to stop. The critical question is no longer how the American trap was sprung, but why. Precisely at the moment when the reality of that trap became undeniably clear, Nishimura consciously chose to drive his bleeding, blind ships deeper into the abyss. To the modern observer, the order to advance sounds like the command of a man who had lost his mind. But Nishimura was not insane. He was a rational officer, trapped inside a rigid military system that had systematically stripped him of alternatives. The Imperial Japanese Navy did not empower its field commanders to abort operations simply because a tactical situation deteriorated. Operation Sho-Go was a sprawling, synchronized mechanism involving multiple fleets converging on Leyte Gulf. To unilaterally turn his ships around, to abandon his assigned vector, would not just be considered a tactical retreat. In the unforgiving culture of the Japanese High Command, it bordered on outright treason. Nishimura was bound by a doctrine demanding absolute obedience to the master plan, regardless of the cost in steel. But his refusal to reverse course was also anchored in a brutal strategic reality. By late 1944, the Japanese Empire was actively suffocating, starved of oil. The Philippines were the critical geographic bottleneck connecting the home islands to vital southern fuel reserves. If the American invasion succeeded and that supply line was severed, the Imperial Navy would be permanently paralyzed. Nishimura knew exactly what that meant for the Yamashiro. If he managed to retreat through the gauntlet of torpedoes and preserve his obsolete battleships, he would simply be saving them to rust quietly in a harbor, possessing no fuel to ever fight again. In the grand calculus of the war, preserving his squadron at the cost of abandoning the Philippines was completely pointless. This grim strategic math intersected with a deep, pervasive fatalism that had consumed the Japanese officer corps by the autumn of 1944. The era of sweeping victories was long dead. This was the era of the final stand. This fatalism may have been profoundly amplified by a quiet personal tragedy. Enduring rumors within the fleet suggested Nishimura had recently received word of his own son's death, a pilot killed defending these very islands. While this cannot be proven as the singular reason for his actions, it offers a chilling psychological context. A commander who has already accepted the loss of his family, his empire, and his future is a man who no longer fears the dark. Standing on a heavily damaged bridge, surrounded by the burning wreckage of his vanguard, Nishimura faced the ultimate internal conflict. He knew the element of surprise was gone. He knew his fleet was bleeding to death. Yet, the military system that had molded his entire life explicitly forbade him from saving his men or altering the doomed plan. Denied the fundamental right to retreat, Nishimura made the only choice his culture allowed. He embraced the fatal order to its absolute, violent end. With the Yamashiro shuddering beneath him, he pointed his bow directly north, driving his blind, battered flagship straight into the ultimate technological nightmare waiting in the blackness ahead. The technological asymmetry of the battle reached its terrifying peak precisely at 3:16 a.m. While Nishimura's elite lookouts were still staring desperately into the impenetrable darkness, trying to locate an enemy they could not see, the advanced Mark 8 fire control radar aboard the American battleship USS West Virginia had already locked on to the Yamashiro. From an astonishing distance of 42,000 yards, nearly 21 nautical miles, the American radar operators were quietly, mechanically tracking the crippled Japanese flagship. For 35 agonizing minutes, the Americans simply watched the glowing blips crawl across their screens. They were not firing wildly into the dark. They were calculating complex firing solutions, factoring in range, speed, and heading with cold, mathematical precision. Nishimura, entirely unaware that he was being tracked from such a distance, continued to sail his bleeding ships blindly forward, straight into a perfectly executed tactical ambush. At 3:51 a.m., the waiting ended. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, commanding the American battle line, had drawn a lethal horizontal line across the northern exit of the strait. He had 6 battleships waiting, and 5 of them were the resurrected ghosts of Pearl Harbor, ships that had been sunk or heavily damaged 3 years earlier and meticulously rebuilt for this exact moment. When the range dropped to 22,000 yards, the trap finally sprang. The West Virginia opened fire, instantly followed by the Tennessee and the California. A relentless, devastating rain of 14 and 16-inch armor-piercing shells descended from the pitch-black void. For Nishimura on the Yamashiro, the destruction did not begin with a visible enemy. It began with the sky falling. The heavy shells, guided by invisible radar beams, slammed into the Japanese flagship with terrifying accuracy. Because Nishimura was advancing in a single column, while the American battle line was deployed horizontally across his path, Oldendorf had achieved the ultimate naval maneuver. He had perfectly crossed Nishimura's T. This meant the American battleships could bring all their heavy guns to bear in massive, coordinated broadsides, pouring a sheer volume of fire into the narrow channel that was impossible to escape. Meanwhile, the Yamashiro, trapped in a head-on approach and hemmed in by the strait, could only return fire with her forward turrets. Flesh, steel, and blind courage were being systematically obliterated by mathematics, radar geometry, and overwhelming, invisible firepower. The Yamashiro was torn apart under the relentless barrage. Battered, burning, and fundamentally outmatched, the flagship finally slipped beneath the black waves, taking Vice Admiral Nishimura and his rigid adherence to an obsolete doctrine down with it. But the night in the strait was not quite over. Shortly after the black waters closed over the Yamashiro, the second half of the fractured Japanese plan finally arrived at the southern entrance of the strait. Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima, commanding the trailing support force, had been 40 miles behind Nishimura all night. Now, pushing into the channel, he did not find an open path to Leyte Gulf. He sailed straight into a graveyard. The narrow strait was illuminated by the eerie glow of burning Japanese destroyers and the drifting, fiery remains of the Fuso. Blinded by the thick, choking smoke of the disaster, Shima's flagship, the heavy cruiser Nachi, violently collided with the crippled, burning cruiser Mogami, which was desperately trying to crawl southward, away from the radar-guided slaughter. Surveying the apocalyptic wreckage, Shima quickly realized that Nishimura's force had been completely obliterated. The American trap was sprung, the defensive line was fully alerted, and the element of surprise was a distant memory. Shima ordered a futile, blind spread of torpedoes, fired northward into the impenetrable dark, hoping to strike whatever invisible monsters had devoured the Yamashiro. But then, he made a decision that fundamentally contradicted the rigid, fatalistic doctrine that had just killed his colleague. He ordered his ships to turn their bows south. He aborted the mission, broke the master timetable, and retreated into the Sulu Sea, successfully saving his remaining forces. This sudden, pragmatic withdrawal forces a profound reevaluation of the entire tragedy in Surigao Strait. We are left with a haunting, uncomfortable question about the nature of military command. Why did one Japanese admiral deem it entirely acceptable to cut his losses and retreat, while another felt so totally constrained by the system that he drove a shattered, bleeding squadron straight into factual annihilation? Who was the more responsible officer? The commander who followed his assigned orders to the absolute letter, sacrificing thousands of men in a hopeless, unsupported charge, or the commander who looked at a doomed tactical reality, defied the inflexible will of Tokyo, and chose to keep his sailors alive. This stark, jarring contrast in leadership exposes the deepest, most fatal flaw that ultimately destroyed the Southern force. The tragedy was not just a product of American radar or overwhelming firepower. It was the result of a broken command architecture that sent two independent admirals into the same dark corridor, fighting the same battle under completely different rules of survival. In the dark waters of Surigao Strait, it wasn't just a Japanese squadron that was violently dismantled. It was a fatal, decades-old illusion. The Imperial Japanese Navy was forced to realize that raw human bravery, fanatical discipline, and flawless night training could never overcome cold mathematics, advanced radar, and an enemy that could see in the dark. But beyond the failure of technology, Surigao Strait exposed the ultimate cost of a rigid military culture that prioritized blind obedience to a doomed plan over the survival of its own sailors. Vice Admiral Nishimura did not simply sail into an American ambush. He sailed into the inevitable dead end of an inflexible doctrine, taking a shattered era of naval warfare down into the black water with him.